So thank you, everybody, for coming. I think I know everybody, or no, I don't actually, but I'm Abe Miller-Rushing. I'm the science coordinator for the park. But today, we're really fortunate to have Matthew Duveneck coming in to talk to us about future forests. And Matthew is actually one of our second century stewardship fellows, who's been doing the fellowship for a little over a year now, right? He's on the faculty at the New England Conservancy, and then Conservatory, the New England Conservatory, and also has a research position at the Harvard Forest. And he's super expert at doing this kind of modeling of what our future forests will look like here in Acadia. So really excited. I'll let you say a little bit more about yourself and then kind of just go right into the top.
Sure.
Thanks so much. Thanks for coming up.
Well, thank you so much, Abe, and thanks for having me. Delighted to be here. A lot of my work has been with help from a lot of you, so I really appreciate that. And delighted with the opportunity to do the second century fellowship. Yes, I have sort of a unique position where I teach in the liberal arts department at the New England Conservatory, which is a music school. So I teach musicians environmental science electives. But then I also do research through Harvard Forest and other outfits in forest ecology, where I did a postdoc now years ago, and so it's sort of continued work there. I'm happy to talk more about myself, but I'd rather talk about Acadia and the future of Acadia's forest. So I'll jump in on that, and if you have questions about me, we can get to that later. So from my SCS proposal, future threats to Acadia's forests are largely uncertain. How climate change, insects, land use, and other disturbances may interact and shape future forests remain largely unknown. Unfortunately, I would say they're still unknown, but we're learning some things. So I use models, and it's important to recognize that all models are wrong, but hopefully the one I'm using will be useful. But there's no perfect model, and I'm not making predictions, but rather sort of exploring plausible scenarios of the future. So when we hear research talks, we often sort of start with an introduction and methods and get into the results and discussion, but I'm going to start right now with a result. And then we're going to back up and talk about some methods and such. So this is the type of thing that I'm doing. So this is a future scenario of Acadia National Park and looking at climate static, so no climate change in this particular run. Disturbances, none, no disturbances, and management, none. So this is kind of the baseline scenario that I started with. What is included is successional dynamics of forest succession. Forest is changing through its own successional competitive patterns. It's a 100-year simulation, and the map is showing whether a forest type was the same as when it started, or if it changed, if it was different. So we just have same and different. And then on the bottom, we see the different forest types, so the forest groups, species groups that are together. Simulated 31 different tree species all at once, but then I lump them into these 8 groups just for simplicity. And so what you can see is that forest is fairly static over 100 years using no disturbance, no management, no climate change. Keep that in mind. That might not be what happens next. Oh, and of course, there's a heck of a lot of spruce, which you all know. So, yeah. Okay, so now into some methods. So I start with a forest inventory data, mostly based on FIA data that has been linked up with satellite information to impute forest conditions across the park. And then I'm using a model called Landis at 30-meter resolution, which has these interconnected cells that fires, for example, can spread from cell to cell, although I didn't include fire in these simulations. Insects can spread. Seeds can be dispersed across these different interacting cells. Then within each cell, I'm running a succession model that's part of land is called peanut succession. And so within peanut, I'm simulating the species-specific photosynthesis on a cell. And that's a function of the water, how much rainfall is coming in, how much water is evaporating out, transpiring, percolating. It's based on the soil texture and depth, which is also 30-meter resolution. And it's using climate information, the monthly temperature and rainfall and photosynthetic active radiation. And I'm using a static climate as well as a climate change projection using the RCP 8.5, which is a high emission projection for the future. And then, yeah, it was in light. It's also the foliar nitrogen content turns out is a very important piece of how the species compete with each other. And then the optimal temperature of the individual species and the competitive interactions are all happening within those cells. And this map is the starting biomass of red spruce at year 0. So it starts at year 0 and then it simulates forward. And so I've got in previous work at the New England scale, I did a bunch of work with this same model, but at a much coarser resolution and looking at all of New England. And we found, for example, that a lot of the forests in New England are still recovering from their 19th century land use. And that climate change will increase the forest biomass by itself, if you're just looking at climate change itself. And here is a result showing why that is. That if you have, okay, if I stand up?
Absolutely.
So if you have, this black line is the net primary photosynthesis over time, and this is the static climate projection, this black line. And then the colored lines are different climate change projections. And so you see this, we have a much earlier spring. And so with an earlier spring under climate change, the forests grow more in the spring. And in fact, they pop out, forget the summer for a minute, they pop out in this fall too, but there's more light in the spring, there's more photosynthesis in the spring. But then it dips down in the summer, where there's high respiration projections under climate change. And so there's this trade-off between, yeah, you get an earlier spring, but you also get more respiration in the summer. And so we were able to kind of show that, to show that climate change looks pretty good for these forests, which is a hard story to tell, perhaps. But we told it. Oh, and this is also true for, we separated this out. This is all of New England. We separated that out for just the spruce forests. And indeed, we had the same sort of pattern projected. So we also said, well, what is driving the change if it's not climate change? Well, in New England as a whole, and Acadia is different because a great deal of the change expected in New England was coming from land use, mostly logging. There's not a lot of logging happening here. But so the corporate lands had in New England had a big decrease in the change in above ground carbon in this case. Now, not all results showed such an optimistic story around climate change. This is some of the Lewis Iverson work showing the suitable habitat model. And so on the left, you have sort of the current conditions of suitable habitat for red spruce, and under the right, the climate change projections of suitable habitat. And so you see, Iverson says, we're going to lose the suitable habitat for spruce. So this is a big problem. So indeed, there's sort of a difference between some of my work and Lewis's work. It's important to remember that his work and others are projecting this suitable habitat, not exactly where these trees are going to be, but simply how suitable will the habitat for them be. So here are some results from Acadia, which is indeed somewhat counter to Iverson's work, simulating climate change by itself with no other disturbances or management. I see that above ground carbon and indeed spruce, increases with climate change. So the solid line is climate change, the dots are static climate. So if you look at total biomass, this is above ground biomass density, the average above ground biomass density across Acadia National Park includes an increase under static climate and an even more of an increase under climate change. And I would say that's largely due to those earlier springs under climate change. And we see that that increases for red spruce as well as for white pine. Balsam fir takes a bar. Balsam fir doesn't do quite as well, but there's less of it. But again, this is just looking at no disturbances and no management. Now, Acadia has had very little disturbance for the last 76 years, as I'm sure you all know.
76.
Specifically, right? Did I get it right?
That sounds right.
Yeah. So this is a picture that Jesse and Kate took me to, this red pine last year that died. There's some exceptions where you've had some red pine loss for sure. But the massive disturbances are less so. So I love this quote, but there are also unknown unknowns. There are things we do not know, we don't know, from Donald Rumsfeld. I don't like when he said it, but I like the quote. And I don't think he thinks much about ecology or disturbance ecology, but I still like the quote. So rather than predicting the future, this black swan theory is describing surprise events that have major effects, things that we don't know, these unknown unknowns. And to me, that's what's going to drive Acadia National Park forests in the future, things that we can't exactly predict. For example, we couldn't have predicted the spread of the chestnut blight across the east. In just a matter of 40 years, chestnut was wiped out completely. We probably couldn't have predicted the 47 fire that happened right here, the years before that fire. And we probably couldn't have predicted the visitation rates that you have here, both the dip from the pandemic and the massive recovery. And what's going to happen to visitation next? I'm sure you all are thinking about that. So I explored, with help, some what if scenarios, specifically from Nick and Kate and Jesse and Abe and others, to sort of think about, like, well, let's just explore some what if scenarios that we can put on top of climate change and the forest succession. So one of them is this. It's this idea of a fast pathogen that comes in and wipes out 100% of all red spruce in these different patches. And so this is the increase in those patches simulated over 100 years. So you can see that by year 25 or so, 80% of the landscape is covered with this pathogen, and it knocks out 80% of all the spruce. So I'm not trying to predict what that pathogen is, what it's called, but it's possible that something could come in and wipe out the spruce in that way, in that sort of black swan concept. So that's the fast pathogen. A slow pathogen is something that comes in and covers the whole landscape even faster, actually, but it only takes out 3% of the host of the spruce. And so it's just kind of like a light thinning, but it's constantly happening. So every single year it's knocking out 3% of the spruce over time. Another thing I've explored is a drought scenario where I made a 10-year drought. So this is the monthly rainfall projected over the next 100 years with one of the global circulation models. But then I said, okay, in year 2070, let's reduce all that water by 70% for 10 years and see what happens. So that was another sort of black swan theory. This one was a little more challenging, which I'll get to. So then I said, well, what are we gonna do about that? Well, let's think about a resist scenario where we are resisting the change. So we're gonna add more red spruce. If red spruce gets wiped out, we need to plant red spruce. So in this resist scenario, we planted 10% of the disturbed sites every 5 years with red spruce starting in year 20. And so we know that planting wouldn't be even possible on all the sites at Acadia. But again, plausibly, yeah, if we say we really care about red spruce persisting and the disturbance is going to take it out, maybe we should keep it here by planting some more. And then an adaptation scenario where instead of red spruce, we say, well, the heck with red spruce, we're going to lose that. Let's plant 10% of disturbed sites every year with these climate suitable species. And I selected chestnut oak, shagbark hickory, and loblolly pine. And the chestnut oak and shagbark hickory are very close, if not present in the park, but with distributions much that extend further south, as you can see. Loblolly pine is indeed, as you know, is much further. It's a southern pine, but functionally perhaps more similar than the oak and hickory to the spruce, which I'm projecting to lose. And so functionally, perhaps if there was something more similar, maybe that's a good idea. This is a model. We can turn these dials and see what happens. So that's what I use, these three species. Okay, so disturbance regimes, I have the grow only, which is no disturbance. I have the fast pathogen, the slow pathogen, and the drought. Mixed with that, I have the management, no management with the grow only, do nothing, resist, and adapt. Do nothing, resist, adapt, do nothing, resist, adapt. You can see I'm adding a heck of a lot of scenarios. Then we added static climate, okay, that's 10 scenarios. And then climate change, that doubled that. So I have 20 different scenarios, which I simulated, which is an awful lot. And it's hard to see the results because there's so many different things interacting and going on. So here they are. So as a reminder, this is, I showed you this before, just to remind us that under succession only, that we have an increase in above ground biomass projected under climate change and static climate, even more under climate change for red spruce and the total. And I've got 31 different species going on here. So the black swan disturbances indeed mix things up and change this. So for simplicity, I'm just looking at the climate change alone. So I took out the static climate. And the fast pathogen, let's maybe just look at spruce for now. That's the obvious one. So here's the average red spruce biomass. Fast pathogen knocked it out by 70% or something, but it still persisted. Remember, I left some of those sites present over time. So it still persisted, but at a substantially less biomass. The slow pathogen, it indeed sort of dropped it and kept pushing it back over time. And the drought, interestingly enough, it sure knocked it down by 2080, but then the drought I turned the drought off, and that spruce largely recovered. Yeah, turn it on off. And in total biomass, you see, of course, so much of the total biomass is made up of the spruce, and so we see a similar pattern here. Okay, under the resist and adapt scenarios, there's again a lot to look at. So here's the total biomass, and resist did not increase much of the simulated biomass by the end. So the resist scenarios are the purple and orange, and so those are right in here. And so the resist didn't add much more biomass. So the resist scenario, planting spruce, was not particularly successful at increasing total biomass. However, the adapt scenarios largely made up of the, I just forgot, the chestnut oak was the real winner, which you'll see in a moment. But so these yellow and brown lines, that's the chestnut oak really took off in those scenarios to do quite well. And if we just look at the red spruce, so what is the effect of the red spruce on with those adapt and resist? So we get very, very little, in fact, you can't even see the change here in the slow pathogen, the fast pathogen resist is in here, and the slow pathogen resist. Indeed, we get a tiny increase in spruce. So spatially, what's going on? Under a climate change in a slow pathogen, this is the slow pathogen, we have the spruce is declining, but it's still dominant in area. And so this again is that concept that, you know, the green color in the map are areas that stayed the same forest type after 100 years. And that this slow pathogen has decreased spruce, the pink spruce has decreased. And under this slow pathogen. If we look at the fast pathogen, indeed, we get a lot more change. We get a lot of turnover in forest type throughout the park. And a large reduction in spruce. And that reduction in spruce, this is the proportional area. So this is no longer biomass, but the proportional area of a dominant forest type. And so as the spruce decreases, we have an increase in the northern pine, which is white pine, and we have an increase in the fir, in this case, the fir group. And the maple group and as well. Under the resist scenario, I'm going to go back and forth here. So here's the fast pathogen with no management, and here's the fast pathogen with resist. Again, we see very little change. Now, when we add the adapt scenario, this is again where we get a big change, where this oak increases dramatically. This southern pine we see pop up a little bit in here, but for some reason that southern pine doesn't take off. And so this is the loblolly. The loblolly increases just a little bit when it's planted, but it doesn't take over the landscape. But there's a little bit that stays on the landscape over time, which is interesting by itself. When we look at the above ground biomass of those three planted adapt species, here we see that the chestnut oak has increased dramatically under climate change. Of course, all three species do well under climate change, which we expect. That was by design. We're planting species that would do well under climate change, compared to static climate, which you see happening in there as well. The fast pathogen is allowing the most climate suitable species success because there's the most disturbance. So when you disturb a site, you get a lot more light, you have the ability for more species to take off. Under the drought scenario, which I have in blue here, the drought scenario was tricky because I didn't plant simulated planting in the exact sites that were declining because of the drought. And remember, the drought was just that 1 10-year period. So it was sort of a special kind of different thing that happened. So planting within that drought scenario was a little challenging because I wasn't catching exactly the sites that were becoming available. So a couple interesting nuances. One thing that was interesting, so if you look at, this is the scenario with very little change. So no disturbance and no management. And with climate change, the 8.5 over 100 years. And it's a little hard to tell, but you can see that Eastern MDI has the most amount of high, what's called dissimilarity, which is the change in species composition over that 100-year period. And this is largely due, I understand it from the experts in the room, that Eastern MDI has more early successional species, more early successional systems largely dominated from the 47 fire, and that these over 100 years are changing a lot. Versus the rest of the park, there's less of that. A lot of that spruce is dominant in the rest. What's interesting is that when you add a lot of disturbance, you get a flip. Eastern, this is now with the fast pathogen and the adapt scenario. Eastern MDI has a lot more green, a lot more low dissimilarity, and the rest of the park has more high dissimilarity. Which again is simply because there's more spruce in this scenario that is flipping because of the high disturbance. And so under no disturbance, we can expect more change to happen in Eastern MDI. With a lot of disturbance, we can expect more disturbance to happen in a different time. Here's something else interesting. Under static climate, here's the static climate, no climate change, but a fast pathogen and no management. We have this big increase in fir, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of the spruce sites that are declining, here's the decline in spruce. A lot of them would be suitable for fir. And in fact, there may be fir mixed in with the spruce in a lot of those sites. And so it would make sense if we take out the spruce, the fir is waiting in the winds as an insurance species to take off under static climate. But what happens under climate change? Well, I was surprised to see that under climate change, we get the same pattern in that the fir expanded under climate change and under static climate. Well, this could be a problem because even if they're expanding in area, we know we might expect them not to do well under climate change. So it may not be a good insurance species. So if spruce declines, and what you look around, oh, well, there's a fir there, the fir will take off, but the fir may not actually do well. So even though the dominant area might create a dominance in area, the biomass density of fir, as we see, declines under climate change. So this is now all 20 scenarios across these 6 species, which is a lot. But just if you kind of glaze your eyes over for a bit and look at just this one here, all the dotted lines are static climate, and all these solid lines are climate change. And you can see that the balsam fir is under climate change, it's not doing so well. And so if we go back and say balsam fir under, see a thing, under if that's the balsam fir in that area that has expanded because we lost the spruce, but then the biomass is going to crash. That's not such a good thing. So what else? Future exploration. So here's a couple things that I find interesting that one could do, which I haven't done, but it could be me, could be someone else in the future. This is some work I did for my PhD, where we looked at different ways to measure resilience. And so where we looked at a specific disturbance, and we said, okay, what is the, in this case of the fire, what was the pre-fire biomass and species composition? And then we said, what's the immediately post-fire? So we have a big disturbance and it changes. We lose a bunch of biomass and we lose the species composition. But then the question is, well, how does it recover? What is the resilience? And that over time, let's say this is 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years post-fire, how much has that recovered back to the starting condition in these multiple dimensions? And then we could measure the distance between the inverse distance of this and get it some sort of an index of resilience. So this is something I thought about exploring with these scenarios, and I haven't, but it's something, as I said, that could be explored. Here's another thing, specific ecosystem services. So this is a paper that looked at specific wildlife habitat from a bunch of scenarios. This is at in Vermont, I believe, where we looked at similar model, but looked at how these particular species, wildlife species, do under these changing conditions. So again, that's something else, sort of a value added to these sorts of results, that if there were specific wildlife species that were of interest that depended on specific habitat, these sort of results could be used for that. Another one, this is a project out of Quebec, where we looked at the functional network in a very fragmented landscape. And where functional network is partly looking at functional diversity and the functional redundancy of different species, ultimately the ability of a landscape to be in this interconnected network with these different nodes and links across the landscape. So it occurred to me that, well, with Acadia being I thought so many islands, that this sort of island geography might be an interesting way, an interesting use of this sort of approach. And the concept is that it's important in landscape ecology, it's important for species to be able to move across this landscape. And if they're cut off because they're fragmented, or because we have a loss of a stepping stone node, then in the future, that landscape may decline in its ability to function through these different ways. So this would be an interesting landscape to explore some of this because of these very specific sort of island shapes that would that has a unique geography. 35 minutes-ish. Are there hanging questions?
Sorry, just to clarify, when you had the projected graphs and saw the expanding maple and stuff, that smaller graph was the amount of land that would be available for those species, but not necessarily that they would completely fill that space.
These graphs?
Yeah.
This one is the simulated, projected proportional area. So this is looking at, I looked at all of the landscape and said, well, how many cells are dominated by maple?
Okay.
How many cells are dominated by spruce? And so at each year.
Mm-hmm. So then.
So it is where I talked about the suitable habitat was a different model. That was
Right. But then you talked about the biomass afterwards, and so within this little graph, if you were saying that the fir may not completely, so you're saying it won't?
So, yeah, it's an interesting, I think I understand your question, and I don't quite understand it myself, except that, so the biomass is dominated by that fir in this scenario, but that's the biomass, the proportional biomass. But that over time, and perhaps after 100 years, which is a long time to simulate anything, we might expect that not to do well.
Got it, okay.
It's a big vulnerable biomass, essentially.
It's right, thank you. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It is a sort of an increased in vulnerability.
Okay.
And it's already not doing well.
Mhm.
Like balsam Malay does it, like it doesn't get very big. And so that's another reason to not put a lot of carbon.
It wouldn't be a good functional replacement.
Wouldn't,
Yeah, not a good, I think of like the functional replacement, so I like how you're putting loblolly pine or other sun pines and kind of what would those options be? And then how vulnerable or less vulnerable might they be in terms of how we make choices about what to augment, like whether it's an adapt strategy that you proposed. I also kind of wonder how you might suggest. So most of the management is none or like very little, because when we say management, we mean mostly forestry, right? Like logging, silviculture, that kind of management.
which the park is not.
Which the park doesn't do, but I just kind of curious if you ran this at an area like this, but management's on the table.
To cut.
How would that change? So this is more theoretical, I guess, on how you might, and I know you're not making management suggestions right here, recommendations, just kind of
Right.
curious how, and just because of how you proposed that at the beginning, kind of New England wide, how that's making some differences between here in terms of the projection, how climate change in particular might shift, overall biomass trajectories.
Yeah, I mean, I think by looking at, well, first of all, so much of the landscape is dominated by the red spruce. And so those pathogen scenarios that, especially the fast pathogen scenario, it was similar to a
To
logging
look at big,
scenario,
yeah, okay,
right?
yeah.
And so you could, if you want to think, now, I was only going after red spruce, so I didn't touch anything else in that scenario. Well, actually, I ran some others where at first I was thinking, oh, let's try a pine and a maple and see what happens. I said, it's too much. I'm just gonna focus on spruce. But in fact, you might have seen some of the earlier runs that I did with some of those. Others. But in terms of logging, well, if the objective is to have a functionally diverse systems that have redundancy and sort of insurance species, because they're sort of, you're interested in increase in carbon on the landscape for carbon sequestration or selling the wood, then one might argue, I'm not suggesting I am, one might argue that poking some holes in the forest to allow more light in and allow more diverse species would be a good thing to do. However, my understanding is that that's not the park's mission, or not a primary objective of the park. And a lot of other forests in the region do have that mission to manage for fiber, for wood, and I could see having a management strategy that's about, poking holes and getting more diverse species in the landscape. But that may not be in the cards because it's not part of the objectives.
And we're like the only one that's not doing that.
Right.
So like, we gotta
There are
hold
other
on to
parts.
protection, yeah.
Well, and although the forest pests may do that for us to
Right.
some degree,
Well-
like, and just to like put the slow pathogen and the fast pathogen into like. So the fast pathogen would essentially be like the equivalent of what the red pine scale did, right? It just came in and just 3 years, it wiped everything out. And then like hemlock woolly adelgid might be more like the slow pathogen, or at least what we expect to be a slow pathogen here, just kind of weaken and harm some, kill some trees, but most of it is stuff. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and yes, and I think it's important to distinguish the concept of an unknown disturbance, of saying, yeah, we don't know if it's gonna be just like red pine scale.
Right, that's a scenario,
Yeah,
so. But
it is,
like, these are totally plausible.
these, right,
We've seen
yeah,
them.
exactly, we're right, we've seen them here, yeah.
It's nice to know that it isn't, well, maybe you weren't really looking, that a lot of these models don't show like a major disappearance of forests or trees altogether.
Yeah,
Right, I mean,
Well,
like, or that's still, possibility.
anything's possible, but that's a
Sort
good
of
point.
ability to rebound, I guess.
Yeah. I have a couple answers to that. And one is, I've been fascinated by this concept of these drought scenarios. And my understanding is that a lot of the work by folks at UNH did these drought experiments with enclosures where they kept water out and kept the trees growing. And that it was really, really hard to kill trees with drought. And that,
Without a disease or something else on top.
correct, yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And in fact, I'm finding the same thing, that I had to really ramp up the drought in order to show an effect in this landscape. Now, one could argue that, well, it wasn't big enough, or it lasted for 10 years, but what would 15 years cause? Or, what if it was, 70% reduction for 10 years and then 50% for the next 10 years? Yeah, well, there's an infinite number of possible scenarios, but there's an awful lot of seeds in the seed bank for something to grow. Even if a single tree dies of a drought on a site, these 30-meter cells, something else is there to grow. But with a lot more fire, for example, or more frequent, could you have more of a savanna landscape on top of some of these disturbances? Is it possible? Sure, possible, but that's not what I projected.
Other questions?
Yeah, I'm interested in pitch pine. You know, it seems to be like possibly one of our insurance species. It's southern kind of range, not shade tolerant at all, but like, I feel like in my mind, I'm like, if there's a big disturbance, I'm kind of counting on pitch pine to be able to, that and red maple to kind of hold the line. And I know that you kind of combined a lot of species, but it would be interesting to add,
Pitch pine.
yeah,
Sure.
pitch pine and maybe red maple to separate, unless red maple was the dominant maple.
No,
Red Maple Group.
I did have,
Oh, did you have that?
Yeah, maple.
Maybe-
red maple I do, but
Oh, sorry.
I'll show
Just
you.
looking at the spruce.
I'm happy to show you. Yeah, red maple does great.
Everywhere?
Everywhere.
Yeah,
But yeah, pitch pine, you're right, I'll explore that. I'm happy to pull it up. Leaf peepers like red maple.
Oh, is it?
But yeah, a maple disturbance that knocked out red maple and sugar maple would be interesting and possible too.
I was interested, I thought it was really interesting that you, the planting what's already there doesn't actually speed up anything.
I know.
And that, but the planting what, anyhow, the thing that helps is to plant something that's gonna take off, or the thing that has a big effect. I guess you planted some lollipop pine and it stayed as a minor component of the emergent forest, but that's kind of an interesting. The interesting implication that for a restoration strategy, that if you're. To be both in terms of, to be worried about the fact that if you plant something that in that kind of a scenario, that it could take off, because there's a lot of open space for it to go into. But also to not waste your effort doing something that's. That nature's gonna do on its own anyways.
Right. Yeah.
Sorry, did you have more?
No,
Kind of on that, when I hear planting the same thing that was there, right? I'm thinking like a little sapling, not like a big tree, right? Okay, so
They start small.
they start small, yeah. Just making sure.
Yeah.
Not a tree person.
I had the same assumption.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it.
Not a tree person.
You're well on your way to being a tree person. I can tell.
Would it be more susceptible to that pathogen still?
Being small,
Yeah,
good question. I didn't, let's see, how did I specify this pathogen? Many pathogens, like insects, go after a certain age or size tree, like the chestnut. It doesn't affect the young chestnuts,
okay.
but it does the older.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, it's very possible that, now in my pathogen, I have to look back, but I think I said knock out the young stuff as well, but I have the ability, the model has the ability to specify what age range it's gonna kill. But you're absolutely right, that some pathogens are host specific to a specific species. However, it really only goes after a particular size distribution, only the middle age, or like the bark beetles, that's a real common problem in bark beetle ecology, that if you have a monoculture of a specific size pine,
Mhm.
the bark beetles hit those hard.
We got a question online. Eric, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and just ask?
Sure. Just seeing in my former state that there was the management decisions sometimes would be at odds if you're trying to optimize towards, let's say, biomass versus biodiversity versus ecological resiliency. Came from the Pine Barrens where they should have jumped on the beetle response much quicker. So I saw that firsthand, and it's just sad to see. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, maybe Abe's thoughts and others about, this is an amazing tool. But how do you navigate those conversations? And then there's also the cultural landscape, right? There's certain elements that are unique to national park is how do you thread that needle?
Do you want to- Yeah, I think that's, talk about it. Get the right people in the room to discuss. I mean, one of the things that I really like is that, we can plant, we can explore these adapt scenarios without putting anything in the ground, without doing this. A lot of my work, that resilience slide I showed, I presented some similar work in Minnesota to, in the Northern Great Lakes region, in the northern lower Michigan and northeastern Minnesota, and showing that climate change was not doing well on those forests. This is maybe 5 years ago. And the Nature Conservancy launched a massive planting campaign, in part based on those results. And they're trying something out. Now, they have the ability to plant on state forest lands that with, I think, a lot fewer restrictions and maybe a broader concept of what a future resilient forest is than a Park Service land. But they're trying something. And they started with a model and they say, okay, well, here's some model results. We're inspired. Let's try something. And they're doing it. So those conversations happen, but they have to happen with the right people.
Yeah, I would, Eric, I would say that we're totally having those conversations, like Park Service wide. I think generally national parks are managing towards like ecological integrity, but exactly what that means in in a changing climate and changing ecosystems, I think we're thinking about. And I think that resilience and biodiversity and biomass all play roles in that, and that I think, we also, at least, so I do agree with what Matthew just said, that like we should be talking about it more, but and continue talking about it. But also I think another thing to keep in mind kind of goes back to some of Kate's previous work, like showing like what our niche on the landscape is, like what kind of functional niche the parks, particularly in the Northeast, the national parks play a particular roles on the landscape in terms of having more biodiversity or kind of seeding certain kinds of species into the kind of broader forest demands landscape. And so we can think about that too in terms of where we're making our management decisions. It's kind of amazing how much flexibility we do have within our management policies within the Park Service. And as an agency, we're still figuring out where we want to go, but the policies give us a lot of flexibility, which is kind of a blessing and a curse, I guess, both. But anyhow, that's a kind of a non-answer too, also. But just to show that there's a lot of flexibility, and we should try things or have conversations and try things and learn as we go to what works. Is that helpful at all, Eric?
Yeah, no, I think any one goal followed to an extreme leads to absurdism. Right? So in New Jersey, people are saying, well, we just need to maximize biomass, and some were just pushing massive monocultures, right? Just pure biomass. But then if you have more ecologically compressed forests, then they're more susceptible to pathogens. Right. So it's a really interesting space. And Abe, I give you and the team a huge amount of credit, having lived next to a national park in New Jersey, which was ranked as being at imminent risk of ecological collapse. I really applaud the esprit de corps of Acadia, where folks are willing to try things. So it is refreshing, and it was a good answer to you both. And I really appreciate, thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah. Did anybody else have any responses to that? I know other folks in the room.
I'm not a science person, but I would say just the newest signs that you put up about the resist, adapt, direct strategy for the small percentage of visitors that read the signs that are gonna be curious, that hopefully the conversation is gonna start there maybe. You know, that this has already happened, this is what we did, and I just thought those were really great signs for this summer and just, you know, for the little visiting public to get the conversation going somehow, I guess.
Yeah, for those of you, do you want to describe the signs that you're talking about?
I've just seen them, I think, did Jay do them mostly? It's like some of the tri stands on like nice cedar poles. I've seen one at Cerdamon, and I think there was a social media post this week or recently about, there's one on top of Cadillac, right? Just some of the literal climate change things that whether we call it that or not, that's always, you know, like sort of the tricky area for some part of our interpretation side, trying to appeal or just interest the most amount of people. You know, the language that you put on the signs and just keeping them direct, but this is what we've seen, this is what we've done, is what I felt like the signs really did a good job of doing.
Yeah. It was kind of funny, when we were up there on Cadillac the day after the signs got put up, like, I think half the people we saw were reading the signs that walked by them, so these are signs talking about our restoration projects on Cadillac and at the.
That's a way higher percentage, I think, than usual.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're active, you know, they look, there's something different than just on a flat board, so I think all those little things.
And those are new,
Those are new, yeah, they just went out last week.
great.
Catherine just posted a link in the chat, but we can send around links to the folks that are interested. Other questions that folks have, and including online, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to ask something.
Yeah, I think one of the questions that I have is just how, you know, what could I do next? Or how could these models be used in the future? So I'm interested in that feedback of, for example, if somebody's really excited about a wildlife species or a particular way that this could be used, or a particular, if only I had turned the drought a little further up or down, something, I'm not done. So, I'm open to ideas.
We found, for spruce in particular, like the late summer, August, like drought is particularly harmful.
So
You found that.
intense timing or timing during those.
Yeah,
months.
because it's hot too, hot and sunny. And that can be rough on them.
The late summer, fall.
Yeah, like August. Yeah, August can hurt. Yeah,
It's just an increment growth.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so like the previous year's August precipitation. From the. Yeah, anyway, but it might
Yeah.
be like, I think that particular time period, like. You know, you've got the rainfall for the whole year, but just the drought in that particular point of the year can have a big effect.
Can be, yeah, and interesting, so we could certainly explore that with a model in that it's the precip is coming in at a monthly time step.
Mhm.
So, and then within a month, I've designated how many rainfall events happen. So is it a little sprinkle every day, or is it, you know, several big rainfall events in that month? So we could explore that, you know, looking at August rain and how well that responds to the increment growth for the fall, for the spring, the next year.
Yeah, right, the whole year.
For the whole year, yeah,
Yeah, we found that to be quite sensitive, but
based on,
increment.
increment cores here, the historic,
Yeah. Yeah.
cool.
It looks, sorry to cut things off, it just seems like, it looks like the next group is ready to come in.
Sorry.
Room next, so anybody that has any other ideas for what Matthew can do next, feel free to email Matthew. If you don't have his email, feel free to email me, and I can forward it on to him. But thank you very much. Thanks. That was good.